The Mafia boss can't claim the Black Librarian publicly, but can't sleep without her near. Celeste Monroe stood on the terrace of the Art Institute of Chicago, her hand pressed against the glass railing overlooking Millennium Park. The September evening was crisp, the city lights reflecting off the deep burgundy fabric of her dress. Her locks were pinned in an intricate updo, and for a moment, she felt suspended between the quiet of the museum and the noise of her thoughts. Voices approached around the corner. She recognized one immediately, the man who had held her close just 48 hours ago, the man who had whispered that she was the only person who made him feel human. The same man who now dismissed her in front of others, calling her fine for certain purposes but not exactly the type you bring home to mother. Her heart pounded, a mix of disbelief and hurt. How could someone worship her in private yet act as though she didn't exist in public? How had a quiet librarian from Lincoln Park fallen into a secret, impossible love with one of Chicago's most powerful men? Tonight, every answer she had clung to was about to be questioned. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for the truth. If you're watching, drop a comment and tell us where you are from. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter of this story, coming tomorrow. A special shout out to all our loves and lovelies, both new and returning, watching from the United States, Canada, the Netherlands, South Africa, Australia, Germany, the United Kingdom, and every corner of the world. Thank you for being here and supporting these stories. Your support is the reason we keep creating stories like this. Let's begin. Dominic Valetti moved through the Gold Coast with an ease that came from being the center of a world he had inherited. At 34, he was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair combed perfectly to one side and cold gray eyes that rarely betrayed thought or feeling. His suits were always tailored to fit with absolute precision, a reflection of the control he exercised over everything in his life. From his Lake Forest estate, which stretched across manicured lawns, to the private dock on Lake Michigan, he oversaw an empire built on decades of careful and often brutal expansion. His influence reached the meatpacking districts of the South Side, the shipping ports along the lake, and the corridors of power where politicians sought his counsel and business magnates sought his approval. Dominic had learned early that attachment was weakness. His father's lessons were unforgiving. Love, or even the hint of affection, left one vulnerable. The women who had crossed his path were rarely more than distractions. He had perfected the art of detachment, reducing intimacy to transactions, moments that ended with morning light. Even those who shared his bed occasionally remarked on his skill and intensity, unaware that every touch was carefully measured, every emotion withheld. To the world, he was a man who commanded respect, feared by rivals and courted by the elite, capable of violence without hesitation. To himself, he was a man trapped in a life of precision, every action a response to fear disguised as strength. Across Chicago, in the quieter streets of Rogers Park, Celeste Monroe lived a life that could not have contrasted more sharply with Dominic's. At 29, her brown skin glowed in the sunlight streaming through her apartment windows, and her locks, often pinned up for work, gave her a composed yet natural elegance. Her reading glasses, perpetually slipping down her nose, were a small, intimate detail in a world that demanded attention to appearance and presentation. Celeste had carved out a niche at the Lincoln Park branch of the Chicago Public Library, rising to head of special collections in just a few years. She knew where every rare manuscript, every obscure text, was hidden. Scholars and researchers trusted her knowledge, and her colleagues admired her quiet competence. She had come to Chicago for graduate school, drawn by the promise of intellectual discovery and a city alive with contrasts. Her parents, a postal worker and a nurse retired in Atlanta, had instilled in her a respect for diligence and an understanding of quiet pride. Celeste had built a life that balanced independence with the small comforts of friendship. A modest apartment filled with books, afternoons spent cataloging the past, evenings reading stories of worlds she might never inhabit. She had learned early that being a black woman in predominantly white spaces required vigilance, patience, and a constant negotiation of expectations. Yet beneath her careful composure, there was a longing for connection, a desire for the kind of love that had only ever existed in the novels she curated. The gap between their worlds could not have been wider. Dominic navigated a life of power and visibility, where every decision echoed in the city's political and criminal spheres. His movements were calculated, his alliances strategic, his reputation an armor. Celeste moved in a life of quiet knowledge and personal integrity, a sanctuary of books and thought. The Gold Coast, with its gala events and high-end residences, was a universe apart from the quiet streets of Lincoln Park, where bookstores and coffee shops offered a slower rhythm. Their routines, their expectations, and even their understanding of relationships were fundamentally different. One measured life by influence and control, the other measured it by curiosity, integrity, and the capacity to care deeply. Yet Chicago had a way of drawing opposite forces together. Streets overlapped, paths crossed in unexpected ways, and shared spaces, rare libraries, quiet cafes, or the edges of public parks, became unlikely meeting points. It was in these spaces that Dominic and Celeste were first aware of each other, two lives that seemed incapable of intersecting but bound by an undercurrent neither fully understood. What began as mere observation, a glance across the library, a brief acknowledgement, carried with it a quiet, unspoken curiosity. Fate, or circumstance, had set them on a collision course. Both carried scars from their pasts, Dominic with lessons of cruelty disguised as discipline, Celeste with the weight of navigating spaces that often underestimated her worth. Yet there was something about the other that defied their carefully constructed worlds. For Dominic, she was a figure outside the codes he had been taught to live by, a woman who existed not for display or convenience but on her own terms. For Celeste, he represented danger and allure, a man whose life seemed entirely inaccessible, yet whose presence drew her attention with an intensity she could neither name nor resist. Their first acknowledgement of each other was subtle. Dominic noticed her competence, her calm authority in the stacks, the way she moved with purpose and knowledge. Celeste noticed his attention, the rare pauses in his otherwise controlled manner, the flicker of interest behind eyes trained to assess risk and maintain composure. Both recognized in each other a world they could never fully inhabit, yet neither could ignore. The distance between them was more than physical. It was a measure of expectation, history, and society's invisible lines. A man raised to see women as means to an end could not imagine a connection like this without consequence. A woman who had learned to guard her heart could not easily surrender it. And yet, when paths crossed, even the briefest interactions carried a weight neither had anticipated. It was in this tension, the impossibility, the allure, the silent acknowledgement of difference, that the story of Dominic and Celeste began. Two lives running parallel, shaped by circumstances and choices, were about to be tested by curiosity, desire, and the quiet insistence of fate. The coming chapters would reveal whether the invisible bridge between them could hold, or if the worlds they inhabited would force them apart before either had the chance to admit what was growing between them. It was a gray Tuesday in October when Dominic Folletti first entered the Lincoln Park branch of the Chicago Public Library. He moved with quiet purpose, carrying a leather-bound notebook and an air of control that seemed at odds with the mild autumn chill outside. His goal was simple: research Italian immigration manuscripts for a legitimate business matter, documents that might clarify the provenance of some family properties. He had no expectation of disruption, and certainly no expectation of noticing the librarian who would come to dominate his thoughts. Celeste Monroe approached him with professional courtesy, her steps measured and deliberate. She did not recognize his name when he signed in, and she showed no trace of the reverence or fear that so often greeted men of influence in her city. She asked calmly what he needed and moved with efficiency into the stacks. When she returned, she carried boxes of manuscripts he hadn't even known existed. For a man accustomed to attention and deference, her disregard for his reputation struck him in ways he could not articulate. She treated him simply as a patron needing assistance, nothing more, nothing less. Dominic found the encounter disorienting. He was used to people seeing him first as Dominic Folletti, the heir, the boss, the man whose name opened doors and commanded respect. Celeste saw none of that. Her attention was on the work at hand, on the manuscripts, on the accuracy of her care. The absence of expectation unsettled him in ways he had never experienced, and he left the library that day with a feeling he had learned to suppress: curiosity. He returned the following week, ostensibly for research. And then the week after. Each visit carried a pretext that grew more tenuous: a vague question about Italian literature, a minor inquiry about translation accuracy, a casual request for books that did not exist on the public catalogue. Celeste continued her professionalism, guiding him through the rare collections with patience and precision. Conversations began to extend beyond logistics, dipping into debates about authors, translations, and historical context. Dominic, who had spent a lifetime using conversation as armor, found himself drawn into discussion, challenged and intrigued by her intelligence. She recommended books he had never encountered despite his heritage. He, in turn, brought her espresso from a cafe his family had owned since the 1920s. What began as professional interaction edged into ritual. He timed his visits around her lunch breaks. She started noticing when he entered, feeling a quiet anticipation that unsettled her as much as it exhilarated her. Neither of them gave the tension a name. To do so would force recognition of impossibilities: her life and his, two worlds that had no reason to align. Winter arrived with its first heavy snowstorm in February. The city streets were slippery, winds cutting through even the warmest coats, but the library remained a haven, quiet except for the occasional muffled cough or the soft turning of pages. Celeste worked late in the rare books vault, cataloging a new acquisition, her focus absolute. Dominic arrived under the pretense of helping her move boxes, an excuse transparent to them both. The library was nearly empty, and the fluorescent overhead lights made the dust in the air visible in the small beams of their movements. It happened when their hands met over a first edition, a spark neither had anticipated. Months of conversation, of shared silences and subtle glances, ignited in a moment of desperate closeness. Dominic, the man accustomed to dominance and detachment, became tentative and careful. He asked what she wanted, listening as if the answer mattered more than any other consideration in his life. Celeste, surprised by the gentleness, allowed herself to respond with a trust that had rarely been given. The encounter stretched beyond any standard of normal intimacy. When it concluded, Dominic did not leave. Instead, he held her, fingers tracing the lines of her spine, until her breathing steadied and her racing thoughts quieted. That night, both recognized a fissure in the worlds they had carefully maintained, an unspoken admission that the other had begun to occupy spaces previously denied to anyone. In the aftermath, Dominic proposed terms, not from a place of strategy but from a mixture of fear and need. Their arrangement was simple yet rigid. They would share the intimacy they craved without the complications of attachment. He would respect her autonomy, she would respect the limitations imposed by his public life. There would be no acknowledgement outside their private encounters, no intrusion into each other's daily routines. No expectations. Celeste, driven by desire and the certainty of his need for her, agreed to the terms, while Dominic accepted them out of fear of confronting emotions that had grown too powerful to ignore. Over the following months, the arrangement shaped itself into routine. The library became their initial point of contact, the space where conversation and observation coexisted with the unacknowledged undercurrent of desire. He would arrive with questions and documents, she would assist, professional and composed. Each visit blurred the lines between research and attention, intellectual curiosity and personal connection. They navigated their interactions with a delicate balance, each aware of the forbidden nature of what was growing between them. Despite the constraints, they learned each other in ways that extended beyond the physical. Dominic discovered nuances in her work ethic, the depth of her memory, the intensity of her focus. Celeste noticed subtle shifts in his demeanor, the rare moments when his mask slipped, revealing vulnerability beneath his carefully controlled exterior. They shared opinions about literature, discussed films they had watched, and spoke of childhood memories, often with pauses that allowed the weight of experience to surface without judgment. Even in the context of restriction, passion flourished. Their connection was physical and intellectual, a combination that challenged both of them to reassess assumptions about desire and intimacy. Celeste found herself questioning the boundaries she had set, captivated by a man who demanded secrecy yet provoked a level of trust and care she had never before experienced. Dominic, who had learned to see affection as weakness, discovered that surrendering control in this space did not diminish him. It revealed depths he had long denied. Months passed, and the pattern persisted. Each meeting reinforced the tension between the worlds they inhabited and the intimacy they shared. Dominic's visits became a lifeline he had not anticipated, the hours spent with Celeste offering a clarity absent from his public life. She, in turn, navigated the duality of being essential to his nights while invisible in his days. The rules they had established remained, but with each encounter, they pushed at the edges, testing limits they had both been careful to observe. The collision was not a single event but a process, a series of discoveries, choices, and shared moments that chipped away at the barriers they had erected. Their first meeting had been professional, their first touch had been accidental, their arrangement had been calculated. Yet with every book discussed, every hand brushed, every quiet conversation held over fading lamplight, the gap between obligation and desire shrank. What had begun as a library patron needing assistance evolved into a silent acknowledgement of connection, a recognition that neither could fully name. The space between them was charged with anticipation, their interactions heavy with the weight of unspoken emotion. The collision had begun the moment their worlds intersected, and it had grown into a force neither could ignore, setting the stage for the choices, confrontations, and vulnerabilities that would define the remainder of their story. For 8 months, Dominic and Celeste nurtured a world hidden from the city, a world that existed only within the walls of her Rogers Park apartment and the fleeting moments they shared elsewhere. Dominic would arrive late at night, entering through the unassuming back door that had become their secret portal. Candles flickered along the shelves, soft music floated through the rooms, and the small space transformed into something separate from the pressures and dangers of his public life. Here, he could be seen as neither mafia boss nor public figure. He could simply exist as Dominic, a man learning to trust, a man drawn to a woman who demanded nothing except honesty. Hours passed in conversations that ranged from the trivial to the intimate. They debated the works of authors neither had previously explored, exchanged thoughts on philosophy, and spoke of the childhoods that had shaped them in ways neither had shared with anyone else. He learned of her father's quiet, invisible harshness, the type that lingered in gestures and silences, and she listened to tales of his father's visible cruelty, the punishments meted out with exacting precision. They traced each other's wounds with care, mapping pain without judgment, and in doing so, built a trust that neither had ever encountered before. Their physical connection remained extraordinary. Every encounter carried an intensity and electricity that consumed them, yet it was the hours afterward that truly bound them. Dominic, a man who had faced threats and commanded obedience without hesitation, could not sleep without her near. In her presence, he surrendered the armor he had perfected over decades. Nights stretched into weekends. He would cook recipes from his grandmother in her tiny kitchen, filling the apartment with aromas that felt foreign yet comforting. Celeste introduced him to films and books that expanded his understanding of the world beyond control and influence. Together, they created routines that felt domestic in their intimacy. Shared meals, quiet mornings, and long discussions about life, love, and loss. When morning arrived, however, the world beyond their private sanctuary reclaimed its rules. Celeste ceased to exist. If they passed each other on the street, he looked through her as if she were invisible. In the library, his behavior reverted to distant professionalism, maintaining the appearance demanded by his life. Mutual acquaintances who casually mentioned seeing them at galleries or events were met with laughter and dismissive claims. To the outside world, Dominic Valetti remained untouchable, detached, and unattached. Each public denial, though made with careful precision, chipped at Celeste's heart in ways she did not immediately acknowledge. The disparity between night and day began to weigh on her. She reminded herself that their private hours should suffice, that she understood his obligations, the nature of his world, and the impossibility of a man of his stature being publicly seen with her. She told herself that her feelings were a privilege, that her access to him, even in secrecy, was extraordinary. But the lie grew heavier with every encounter. The affection that existed behind closed doors became a lens through which she scrutinized every public interaction. Was she a choice or a convenience? An equal in desire or a silent companion tolerated only in darkness? Her thoughts spun with quiet intensity. She noticed the way he paused before acknowledging her in shared spaces, how he skirted her in public events, how the smallest gestures of avoidance became mountains in her mind. Each refusal to integrate their lives outside their hidden moments reinforced a tension between longing and reality. The intimacy they shared in the apartment was undeniable, yet it was countered by the stark absence of recognition elsewhere. Despite this, their bond deepened. Emotional dependence intertwined with desire. Dominic, in relinquishing control within her apartment, revealed sides of himself that others had never seen. Celeste, in turn, allowed herself vulnerability that her upbringing and professional reserve had carefully guarded. They traded secrets of fear, loss, and inadequacy, forming a foundation of trust and understanding. This shared space, though fragile and confined, became a source of stability in their otherwise turbulent lives. The apartment became a theater where their connection was complete. Every touch, every whispered thought, every silent glance carried weight beyond the physical. They learned each other's rhythms, anticipating needs and moods without words. The hours together were both sanctuary and crucible, shaping them into participants in a private experiment of trust and devotion. Outside, life carried on with its expectations, yet inside those walls, neither had to maintain control, perform bravado, or adhere to appearances. They were simply two people finding a rare equilibrium. Even as they crafted this private reality, tension simmered at the edges. Celeste recognized that desire alone could not sustain their relationship. It required acknowledgement, respect, and reciprocity. The knowledge that Dominic's public denial would remain unbroken gnawed at her. She began cataloging moments, tracing patterns in behavior, noting absences and silences. Each act of invisibility magnified the unease that secrecy had initially masked. Her mind, trained to navigate information and detail in her professional life, now analyzed intimacy with the precision of a scholar. Dominic, for his part, wrestled with an unfamiliar vulnerability. He had learned to see affection as risk, attachment as liability. Celeste challenged that perspective. Nights with her disrupted the careful calculations that had governed his life, showing him that surrendering control could produce connection rather than danger. Yet every return to the public world reminded him of the rules he could not escape, the expectations of family, associates, and society at large. This duality demanded constant negotiation, a balancing act that wore at him even as he thrived in her presence. By the end of 8 months, their relationship had evolved into a landscape of contrasts. The apartment was a haven where affection, trust, and desire merged seamlessly. The outside world was a field of vigilance, performance, and avoidance. The weight of these contradictions shaped Celeste's emotional state, instilling a quiet anxiety that questioned whether intimacy could exist without recognition. It also transformed Dominic, exposing a part of himself that craved authenticity, that recognized the hollowness of public approval when measured against private truth. Through shared routines, mutual care, and conversations that stretched long into the night, they mapped an emotional terrain that neither had experienced with anyone else. The love that emerged was forged in secrecy, nourished by intellectual connection, and tested by necessity. It was a love that demanded patience, resilience, and courage. Qualities both had cultivated separately but now discovered anew together. Yet even amid this private sanctuary, the limits of concealment weighed heavily. Celeste increasingly wondered whether she could endure the compartmentalization. The contrast between their shared vulnerability and public invisibility was stark, each encounter in daylight underscoring the restrictions of their arrangement. She questioned whether her presence in his life was valued for herself or for the pleasure of private hours, whether she was truly loved or merely convenient. This tension shaped the trajectory of their connection, preparing them for confrontations neither could avoid indefinitely. It illuminated the depth of Dominic's feelings, the rigidity of the world he had inherited, and the challenge of reconciling desire with the rules he could not defy. Their secret world had become both haven and crucible, a space in which love and longing were intensified by the impossibility of its full acknowledgement. The Art Institute modern wing was alive with movement. Guests in tailored gowns and sharp suits circulated beneath soaring glass ceilings, the September air carrying a hint of excitement. Celeste entered quietly, aware of the grant her department had received, a small triumph that brought her here on her own terms. Her burgundy dress caught the light, locks styled meticulously, her presence understated yet undeniable. She felt a thrill walking among these artworks, a feeling of belonging in a world so unlike her usual routines. Then, across the room, her eyes found him. Dominic stood with two associates, the perfect picture of composed detachment. Their eyes met for a brief moment, his expression unreadable. A familiar ache tugged at her chest as he turned away, treating her as if she were part of the background, furniture to be ignored. She forced herself to breathe steadily, convincing herself this distance was normal, expected. She had prepared for his public denials, but the precision of his indifference cut sharper than any argument. Seeking air, Celeste stepped onto the terrace, letting the city's glow wash over her. The sounds of conversation from around the corner reached her, unmistakably male voices. She stiffened as one voice, smooth and familiar, drew her attention immediately. It was Dominic. The words that followed froze her in place. "The librarian with the locks," one man said, curiosity and amusement in his tone. "Have you noticed her?" The reply came with a lightness that made her stomach drop. "The black girl? She works in special collections. Helpful enough." The questioning continued, probing, seeking his personal judgment. His response carried the weight of casual dismissal. "Women like that are fine for certain purposes, but not exactly the type you bring home to mother." Laughter followed, echoing faintly against the terrace walls. Celeste felt rooted to the spot, tears beginning to blur the lights of the Chicago skyline below. The private hours, the nights he had held her close, the whispered confessions and shared histories, all of it vanished into that single phrase, as if it had never existed. The walk home became a haze. For miles of streets she barely registered, footsteps muffled by grief and disbelief. Every passing car, every lit window seemed to highlight the emptiness she felt inside. When Dominic appeared at her apartment later that night, the door remained locked. Her phone went unanswered. He lingered on the back porch, an hour of silent waiting that ultimately ended in retreat. For 3 weeks, calls went unreturned, visits avoided. Celeste adjusted her schedule, creating distance between the life she had with him in secret and the world that denied her presence. Eventually, confrontation became inevitable. Dominic found her in the library parking garage, where the gray light of evening mingled with the harsh artificial brightness of security lamps. She met him not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a hollow emptiness that mirrored the disconnection she felt inside. She spoke clearly, deliberately, recounting every word she had overheard, every subtle dismissal she had endured in his presence. Her voice was calm, precise, carrying neither accusation nor plea, only acknowledgement. "I heard everything," she said. "I heard the way you described me. I understood the rules we agreed on, the secrecy, the hours behind closed doors. I thought those moments meant something, that when you held me, when you shared your childhood, when you told me I made you feel human, it mattered. I thought it meant I was more than convenient, more than a secret kept for comfort in darkness." Dominic's expression faltered, the weight of her words striking him fully. He searched for a response, a way to reconcile the affection they shared in private with the cold dismissal she had overheard. But she did not wait for an explanation. The truth had been spoken, and it stood between them like a wall of glass. She turned, stepping into the quiet night, her shoulders squared, her resolve clear. Each step carried her away from the apartment, from the safety of familiar walls, and from the man she had loved despite the contradictions. The distance she created was not born of hatred or anger, but from a demand for recognition and respect she had not received. In leaving, she claimed her value on her own terms, refusing to be hidden any longer. Dominic remained in the garage, a figure of tension and regret, watching her retreat. For the first time in years, the control he so carefully maintained slipped through his grasp. The private moments they had shared, once a sanctuary, now seemed both fragile and essential, reminders of what he could no longer assume or take for granted. The fallout was quiet but profound. Celeste immersed herself in her work, reclaiming the rhythms of her life with discipline and focus. She reinforced the boundaries that Dominic had ignored in public, testing both her patience and his capacity for change. He, in turn, was forced to confront the consequences of his dual existence. The man who could command loyalty and respect in the city could not command the heart of the woman he loved without truth and acknowledgement. Days stretched into weeks. Their worlds, once connected in fleeting intimacy, now existed in parallel, separated by silence and the unspoken challenge of reconciliation. Every thought of her brought Dominic to the realization that secrecy and avoidance could not sustain what had begun in honesty and trust. Yet reaching her, earning back the trust she had withdrawn, would require more than words. It would demand transformation, proof, and vulnerability he had rarely practiced. In this space, both of them were changed. Celeste learned the weight of maintaining dignity in love, the necessity of insisting on recognition rather than settling for hidden affection. Dominic confronted the depth of his feelings, the cost of public denial, and the limitations of a life built on control and fear. The events at the Art Institute were not simply a moment of betrayal, they were a reckoning, a pivot point that would define the trajectory of their relationship and test the strength of the bond that had grown in shadows. Their story, once delicate and private, had reached a breaking point. The choices that followed, the risks Dominic would have to take, and the resilience Celeste would insist upon, became the framework for the next chapter. A chapter in which love, trust, and acknowledgement would be measured not by hidden moments alone, but by action, accountability, and courage. Dominic moved through the motions of his life as though on autopilot. Meetings, dinners, and gala events filled his calendar, but none of it reached him. Beautiful women, carefully chosen from families that aligned with his reputation, came and went, yet the distance between them was insurmountable. Every touch felt hollow, every smile forced. Every embrace reminded him that the one he truly wanted remained beyond reach. At night, Celeste's absence became an ache that nothing could soothe. He closed his eyes and saw her standing in the library vault, organizing manuscripts with effortless grace. He reached for her in bed, only to find the sheets empty. Meals went untasted. Sleep became a fleeting visitor. Associates noticed the change. The boss who had been unshakable now seemed distracted, volatile, untethered. Whispers followed him through hallways and offices, hints of concern that unsettled even his closest advisors. One December evening, heavy with alcohol and regret, Dominic abandoned restraint. He drove to Lincoln Park, the streets quiet under a falling snow. The library loomed ahead, its windows dark and locked. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring through glass into the place where he had first encountered her, where the impossible connection had begun. 34 years of training himself to see love as weakness, of hardening his heart against attachment, had prepared him for danger, for loyalty, for betrayal, but never for this. In that frozen moment, surrounded by the silence of the night and the gentle landing of snowflakes, Dominic confronted the truth he had long avoided. His control was gone. His usual certainty, his confidence in his ability to dominate life and relationships, faltered completely. For the first time, he felt the rawness of longing, the emptiness of absence, and the vulnerability of realizing that a single woman, a librarian with quiet strength, held the power to undo him entirely. The cold seeped into his bones, yet he did not move. Every instinct urged him to leave, to return to the world that demanded him as a figure of authority. Instead, he lingered, consumed by regret and desperate need. Love, once a concept he dismissed as weakness, had become the force capable of dismantling the man who had never known how to exist without it. With Celeste refusing to answer calls or open her door, Dominic turned to a method that required patience and humility. He began writing letters by hand, carefully selecting words that carried the weight of truth rather than the embellishment of romance. Each page was a confession of the man he had been, the lessons imposed by his father, and the deep-seated fears that had shaped every choice he made. He wrote of his childhood, of the rigid rules that taught him love was weakness, and of the punishment he endured for any sign of tenderness. He admitted how those lessons had left him blind to genuine connection, how they had twisted his perception of women, and how nearly all of his relationships were transactions rather than bonds. In these letters, he acknowledged shame not for desire but for the poison of inherited belief. The belief that someone like Celeste, brilliant, strong and radiant, could not belong to his world. Dominic recounted, with precise honesty, the moment he met Celeste in the library. How her presence challenged everything he had been taught. How her intellect and courage forced him to examine his assumptions, forcing cracks into the walls he had so carefully built. He described the growing fear of loving her, and how that fear had driven him to act with coldness he did not feel. Each letter peeled back layers of pride and dominance, exposing vulnerability that Dominic had never shared with anyone. For weeks, he sent these letters without expectation, knowing that words alone might not repair the breach. Then, one morning, a single response arrived. Written in Celeste's unmistakable hand, the note contained only 4 words: "Prove it. I'm waiting." Those words were neither a welcome nor an apology. They were a challenge. A demand for accountability, for action, for change. Dominic read them over and over, feeling the weight of every choice he would need to make. They were simple, yet they carried the authority of someone unwilling to settle for empty gestures. They demanded the truth of his intentions, the authenticity of his transformation, and the courage to claim a love he had long feared. For the first time, Dominic understood that redemption would require more than letters, more than promises. It would demand that he align his actions with the man Celeste deserved, proving that love could exist beyond secrecy, fear, and hesitation. The house gleamed with festive lights, the Christmas gathering in full swing. Dominic arrived with Celeste at his side, her locks flowing freely over a black gown that drew every eye. Conversation softened, glasses paused mid-air, and 100 gazes turned toward them, weighing, judging, speculating. Celeste's hand trembled in his, and for a heartbeat, Dominic felt the old reflex of protection and self-preservation. Every lesson, every calculated move from his upbringing screamed at him to explain her presence, to find a reason she was there, to retreat into caution. Instead, he drew a steadying breath and stepped forward, his voice carrying over the room. "I'd like to introduce Celeste Monroe. The woman I love. The woman I intend to marry, if she'll have me." The room fell silent. Eyes widened, whispers halted, and for the first time, the private truth he had kept locked away became impossible to ignore. The authority and finality of his declaration left no room for speculation. Dominic's mother crossed the room. A figure of strength and presence, she had survived her husband's harshness and now commanded the family's legitimate enterprises with quiet certainty. She stopped before Celeste, took her hands firmly, and looked her directly in the eyes. "It's about time my son found someone worthy of him. Welcome to the family." A murmur passed through the room. Tension that had hung for years, born of secrecy and expectation, dissolved in that simple acknowledgement. Celeste exhaled, her shoulders loosening, her eyes bright. Dominic felt the weight of generations of doubt lift from his chest, replaced by a rare and unshakable calm. For Dominic, it was not just a declaration of love, it was the culmination of months of vulnerability, reflection, and the courage to align his actions with the truth of his feelings. For Celeste, it was validation that her insistence on being seen and respected had mattered. In that moment, the private world they had built in shadows intersected with reality. Love, no longer hidden, had a voice, a presence, and the undeniable right to exist in daylight. Celeste did not marry Dominic immediately. She made him wait, insisting he prove that the changes he promised were real. She met his associates, navigating their subtle tests of her resolve and holding her ground against any attempts to intimidate her. Visits to his Lake Forest estate no longer overwhelmed her, she explored each room with confidence. She maintained her career at the library, refusing to become an ornamental figure in his world. She asked him to use his influence for good, ensuring charitable contributions reached vulnerable neighborhoods and pushing him to live up to the man she had glimpsed beneath the armor of his reputation. Gradually, he became that man. 18 months later, they married in a private ceremony on a cliff overlooking Lake Michigan at sunset. Celeste wore a simple white dress adorned with flowers in her locks. Dominic could not hold back tears as he watched her approach. 5 years into their life together, they had 3 children and balanced the shadows of his past with the light of their family. When their eldest daughter asked how they met, Celeste smiled. "Your father came to the library looking for something and found much more than he expected." When the child asked what he wanted to be, Dominic answered softly, "The kind of man worthy of her. I'm still working on it." This story is a testament to refusing to be hidden, insisting on being seen, and understanding that love cannot thrive in secrecy alone. The woman who wins is the one who knows her value and refuses to accept anything less. Thank you, love, for watching this story until the very end. If it touched your heart, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Tomorrow, we will bring another powerful story that will move and inspire you. Your support allows us to keep creating stories that matter. See you in the next one.